Oh, great. Well, listen, welcome everybody to this conversation with Jillian Van Turnhout. Delighted to have you here, Jillian, for your second time. And we're going to explore emigrant roots, the nature of emigration, and how you can retrace through documents and stories the outward journeys of Irish immigrants, so you can find where you came from with a bit of luck and a bit of expertise. But there are many sides to Jillian, and Jillian, you were senator for a while. How did that happen, and did you enjoy it?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had quite an eclectic career. If I was doing a job interview here, Eamon, I might be struggling to bring you through my career. I started in the private sector. I've always been very involved with the Girl Guides. Through that, went to some meetings in Brussels. Through that, got appointed as Secretary General of a youth platform of international youth organisations. Uh, and that brought me to co-found the European Youth Forum, which was a great period of my life to do all of that. Came back to Ireland, back to the private sector, then took a job with the Children's Rights Alliance, which is an NGO in Ireland, which brings together over 100 and plus now organisations working on children's rights. And it was when I was in that role, I was also a member of an EU advisory body. And for that, I was in China. And I got the phone call from then Taoiseach Enda Kenny to ask me would I be a member of the Senate or Upper House to highlight children's rights and how we can further children's rights in Ireland, because that was 2011. At that time, we'd uncovered a lot of our own history. I can see the echoes here in Canada. Obviously, it's a very different story, but actually the parallels are quite similar. Some of the things that we've revealed. So part of my appointment was on children's rights, and I had a magnificent 5 years. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was an honour to be in the upper house, to be one of only 1,000 Irish people probably in history who've served in that way. But I knew that would come to an end as well, because what do they say? All political careers end in failure, and
Well,
I didn't want to live up to that. So I decided to honorably exit at the end of my time, and I set up my own business doing consultancy on governance, but also a business on genealogy, because I'm fascinated with the Irish story and how we've influenced around the world. So that's
yeah.
kind of my I've had lots of different careers, but they've all come together. And that's what brings me here.
Well, I don't want to gloss over
Yeah.
your political career without saying about your success in terms of corporal punishment. And I sometimes age myself when I describe getting whacked in school when I was a kid across the hand, and younger listeners, not even, well, even older listeners are askance that we used to beat children in school. So that was a real achievement of your time in the Senate.
Yeah, and it was a real proud achievement of mine, because when I suggested that I would bring it forward, I was told not now, we're not ready yet, or yes, we agree with you, and maybe it's not really happening, but if we open up this, we'll somehow open up a Pandora's box, and there'll be difficulties in Ireland. And I decided, because of my privileged position of being in the Senate, that I'd nothing to lose by raising it.
Mm.
And I think, Eamon, and this is absolutely true, I knew even if I was the only person, because I didn't know how my colleagues felt at the time on the issue, even if I was the only person, at least a child in Ireland would know that an adult said you should not be hit. So I would
Yeah,
stand up, and at least they would know that. I have to impress my colleagues, not a single person voted against it.
yeah,
Uh, Even though everybody warned me to wait, the time's not right. I was lucky, by the time we got it through, the government joined me in putting down the amendment, and we achieved a ban. And while we were the 47th country in the world, we were only the second common law country.
yeah.
And I've since worked with Scotland and Wales, who brought in a similar change. And this week, I hope now in Canada also there's a private members bill to be tabled, which is super to see,
Yeah.
because we need to show the rest of the world that hitting children is wrong, and all the evidence shows us. But
Yeah.
it's a really proud achievement. And one thing I say to legislators is, the moment I did it, everyone said, "Why didn't we do this
I
years
we
ago?
do. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the problem?" So sometimes one person needs to stand up, and I was privileged to be that person.
Yeah. No, well done. It was a great achievement. Then genealogy, where did that start? I mean, because we all, in a way, fantasize about doing genealogy, and then we give up after we've looked at a few photographs and a birth cert and say, "Oh my God!" And then we put it aside and say, "I must do that again." But you've persisted in the search. How did it all begin?
Well, it all began by when we were struggling. My two older brothers and myself decided what we were trying to think of parents' wedding anniversary, a significant wedding anniversary. It was over 20 years ago. What will we get them? And we came up with this idea to give them a family history course in UCD at the time with John Grenham, who's still very active in genealogy. And so we thought this was a great idea. They could go off, they were coming close to retirement, they could go off and do this course. So they go off and do the course and they come home with homework. And who did they get to do the homework with them is their dutiful daughter. So I started doing bits and I started getting more and more interested in it and bringing into the story. And I think what really was the catalyst for me was as we got more involved, I found out about a cousin, an elderly cousin, a little bit distant from my dad, but knew my dad from being a child. And she was in her early 80s at that time. And I made contact with her and she really had the family story.
And where was she based?
Manchester.
Manchester, yeah.
So she was based in Manchester. And I remember even the first time I decided, I had written to her a few times, so she's real old school. Miss Marple would be the best descriptor I could give of her. She's real old school, so I wrote to her a few times and I said, I think I'd like to visit her because I feel that there's something we have in common. Let's go and visit her. My mum came with me and some people said, "Oh, don't bring her on you." This whole I'm going to Manchester. What's like if she turns out to be not the nice person? She turns out to be the most gorgeous person. She became like a grandmother to me, Margaret Donoghue, and she just had so many great stories. And she died a few years ago, and I still miss my long conversations about the family. And she loved the fact that she could nearly set me on a mission. I could go off and find this out and do this. And she had some brilliant artifacts. One of the things she had was from a great aunt of mine, a set of postcards. My great aunt had been in UCD during 1916. So Tomas MacDonagh tried to tell my great aunt to go home to County Clare. About 2 weeks before, he said, "You should go home for Easter." And my great aunt said, "No, if I go home to the farm, they'll only get me working on the farm. I need to study." And he's going, No, you should go home." A week later, he said he'd organised a car for her to go home. She said, No, I'll stay in Dublin. And so she has memoirs where she's written about being in Dublin. It was all calm on Easter Monday. We have this idea of the rising and the whole, she's went down to O'Connell Street, 2 dead horses, not much happening. So all of this, but she had postcards.
That's
so
amazing.
We donated them to the National Library because, my cousin didn't want anybody to profit from them. So I feel really proud that because of that interest, I've been able to connect and give those cards into our national collection.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic because you often find in families that there's one person that has kind of developed and retrieved the stories, and if you can find those, you're kind of on your way, but it's also, you don't have to go back far before you find yourself, as you describe it, right, really in living Irish history. So it's very, very close to us,
really close, and we don't realize, and we have all the different sides of history, because I think sometimes we'll all hold on to one narrative. And in recent years, I'm hoping with our commemorations that we realize there's layers and that we don't have one narrative to our history and that it's very complicated and that's okay. And we need to understand it. And we didn't live at that time, so we don't know what choices we would have made. So we can just interpret,
Yeah, it's very funny you use that phrase because when I talk to the historians of the Irish here, when we're putting together the 50 Irish Lives project, that's our kind of motto. It's complicated. And don't uncomplicate it, just accept it. And I think in a way, the Irish story in Canada is probably the most complicated in a way. And I know you've been looking at that. Can you kind of summarize the kind of narrative phases of Irish immigration just briefly, so we have a sense of what has happened and what characterizes the Irish profile in Canada?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think there's only more and more sources coming to light. And I think the work you're doing on the 50 Irish Lives is phenomenal. And I'm looking forward to reading more and seeing who gets selected. But if we go back to the 16th century, you have Irish leaving Ireland to go to France. And then they go from France to New France, to Quebec, and are part of that. So we have them coming this circuitous route. Then we have obviously the story of Newfoundland, which probably we're more aware of, and the fishing and people going over for a season at first, a few seasons because it was good trade. We have the timber trade, so the timber coming to Europe, and then there's empty ships going back. So we do see particularly a rise from about 1815 onwards. I suppose, ending up Napoleonic Wars. England is in a severe economic recession.
It is around 1815-ish.
1815-ish. So, you can see this. There's beginning to be a move, mainly from Ulster, mainly Protestants. Some probably have only come from Scotland in the previous 100 years before that, or around. Yeah. So they're looking for a better life. So we're seeing quite a lot of those being attracted in. But from the 1830s on in Canada, there's lots of different schemes. So we're seeing Irish from all different coming to, look, they have a better life. There's ads for get 100 acres, get 1,000 acres. Now, when you think in Ireland that most people came from a townland that was just so small. Yeah. They were small tenant farmers. So actually we see a huge number coming before the famine. And I think sometimes in Irish genealogy, everybody thinks, if I'm in Canada or the US or Australia, they must have come because of the famine.
Yeah. I mean, what strikes me about that is, I mean, it's you're talking certainly up to the 1830s about 2-to-1 Protestants. So you've Protestants leaving Ireland, but then you've also got aristocracy. You've got people like Guy Carleton and Richard Bulkeley or Bulkeley in Nova Scotia, the father of the province. You've got Fitzgibbon. You've got these kind of Irish families because they're there for generations, but they're aristocrats, they're governors, they're the imperial Irish mixed in with then the Protestant, and then of course Catholics start to come in. Well, really into Ottawa, or Bytown, to build a canal. Yeah. So the settlement patterns are actually quite different from what, as you say, what we expect. I mean, I think we're all measuring it against the United States, post-famine immigration and so on. But the Irish in Canada they're pre-famine.
Mainly pre-famine, and I would say you probably see some of those post-famine are coming because they've links here, or they've connected here, or there's, and every family has its own story. But if you look at the pre-famine, even from the 1830s onwards, like quite a significant number of females, because I'm always very interested in looking at the female lines, because we forget those lines at times. And over half of them are females who are coming. And a third of those are single females because they can get a job here. Yeah. And they have a livelihood here. So each person has that story. But if we look at the building like Ontario, how many Irish there were, phenomenal, the numbers of Irish, that you'd hear the accent from home. So you travel all of this way over to here, and you're back with Irish in home territory. And also, for Quebec, the welcoming of Catholics. Yeah. Coming from a country where being Catholic, you had been oppressed for quite some time. So, and as you say about the Protestants, so you've all these different mix of Irish coming. And to find that new start, that new life in this very new land, as far as Europeans are concerned, coming. You showed me some fascinating statistics on the kind of distribution of the Irish in Canada. Now, clearly, they're focused in Quebec, but mainly then in Toronto. And of course, we have to remember Canada only stretched as far as what they called Upper Canada. So, but over the generations, then. Can you give us a rough idea of like the kind of population centers of those who claim Irish ancestry across Canada? We know top of the league is Ontario. What happened? Who's next, as it were? Yeah, well,
the Atlantic provinces.
You have Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, as you say. Like looking even in 2016, 20% of people said in Nova Scotia they'd Irish ancestry, and this is Statistics Canada. This isn't an Irish trying to pump, and this is people. All of these statistics, they have to say that they're actually understated, right? Because it's what people predominantly see themselves on. So, and most people we know, families will have married different families. So, for example, in Quebec, they'll say that while it's actually only reported to be 6%. historians reckon it's 40 to 60%.
Yeah.
If you go down one line of a family branch, you are going to find Irish there. And I think in America, there was a celebration of being Irish. In Canada, we didn't see this through, the 19th century. We didn't see this celebration of being Irish. So many people actually maybe under layers of their family history are Irish and don't really know it.
Right.
Don't understand where their family came from in a certain line of their family. And I think the work that you're doing and the embassy are doing to help people discover and understand, because I've met different Canadians who have gone, this is great to know I'm Irish. I never realized I had these roots, but I always had an affinity. I always felt welcome. So for me, it's just fascinating how different countries understood Irishness. And what does it mean?
Yeah, it's a very good point, because to survive in Canada, to prosper, you had to fit in a way. So you should be Anglican, Protestant, loyal, imperial in a way, and you can see that even here locally. We had John Egan come in, born in Connemara, 1811, comes penniless to the Ottawa Valley, and then through charm and organization and leadership becomes one of the wealthiest lumber barons. But at some early point, he becomes an Anglican to kind of more or less fit in, and he becomes a gentleman, a politician, a wonderful figure. But he would probably be emblematic. So as you say, the Irish in Canada kind of sublimated it in a way that they celebrated it in the United States. They sublimated it here. And you're absolutely right. You kind of find when you talk to Canadians here and you talk about Ireland, they kind of come out of their shell. So it's almost as if we're at a moment where the Irish Canadians are kind of coming out into, not quite into the light, but you know what I mean, kind of coming out from underneath all of the assumptions about being in a kind of pro-British member of the Commonwealth and all that kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting process.
Yeah, and I think from our own side as Irish, we're coming through a process of, we've gone through, a decade of commemorations and understanding our own history and understanding that history is layered and that there isn't one history to any of us. We all have these layers of history. And I think that's part of it, is that perhaps we also portrayed to be Irish, this is what it means, and this is our Irish. Whereas in fact, as we know, anybody who enjoys history knows there's a lot of differences and there's a lot of contradictions in each of our histories.
Yes.
So, people might say, well, my family, where I can tell you, for me, Eamon, is I have a great-grandfather whose house was burnt down by the Black and Tans.
Yeah.
On the other side, I have a great-grandfather who was in the RIC. Yeah. So which narrative do I choose about my family history?
It's a very good point, because I think the paradigm shift in 1916 meant that the boxes that you could tick to be Irish were suddenly reduced to, you were there in 1916, you were a Gaelic speaking Catholic Irish and so on, and all the other varieties were lost, and now we're kind of recovering it in a way, which for Ireland, in both Ireland and Canada, I think it's a similar process of uncovering the kind of the many layers, as you say, of the Irish experience and the Irish perspectives, that because you were an imperialist didn't mean that you weren't Irish, because you'd be, by any measure, but you have family ancestry in Canada.
I do. There was a great family story. I have a third great uncle that I know definitely. There was always this story, this memoirs of this great aunt said that he had sold all the produce and he'd even sold the cart and went off to Australia. And that was the story. Right. So I did, as a good genealogist, I went through records in Australia, I went to Tasmania, I went to New Zealand, no sign of Michael Hassett. And he was very elusive. And I was, went back over the notes, and there was a mention that he went to Perth. And I was like, oh, Perth. There's more than one Perth in the world.
Perhaps you're looking in the wrong place.
Yeah, perhaps the family story isn't quite as, and we know that when stories pass down through generations, I often, when I'm working with clients, will say, just tell me what you know, but even tell me the stories, because there's always a truth, but it may not be where we think the truth is.
There's often a secret too, Jillian, in an Irish family. They don't want you to find out.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
your aunt is actually your mother, that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I've uncovered some secrets, but I do know there was about 10 landlords in Ireland who did a lot of assisted passages to Canada from 1826 onwards. So, because at this time, and I don't think we're fully aware in Ireland, our population was just going up. Like the
Yeah,
growth of population in Ireland was phenomenal. Actually, again, like in Europe, the population was going up, but Ireland was just, you know,
taking
off
off.
the charts, taking off. So landlords obviously wanted to increase the size of land, and the more people you have on land, like it was hugely populated in Ireland. So they encouraged them to take assisted passage to Canada under different schemes. And the government of Canada at the time, the Governor General had
So
a
when did that start, Gillian? Are those kind
in
of
1826, we saw about
as early
12,000,
as that?
as
Interesting.
early as that. Between the famine years, it was over 20,000. And then from about 1851 onwards, they had about 14,000. So like
Right.
up to 1870. So there was quite a number of assisted passages.
So that means the assisted passages basically I'll pay you to get on a boat.
I'll pay you to get on a boat and I'll pay your boat fare. Some landlords would have organised for land to be here in Canada when they got here.
Right.
Others left them high and dry, or
To their own devices. Yeah.
something. But we've got rid of you.
Yeah.
So it depended. There was different. But look, at least they were paying for them to move. And I found my elusive Michael Hassett amongst those, and he went and he lived in Perth in Ontario.
There you go.
And there he goes. So the story was kind of right.
Yeah.
He died in 1898 with his family, living there. So I'm hoping to sometime when I find time to really go forward and see whether there's any living people still here. But there is a great satisfaction to understand where did your ancestors go and why did they go. Like his sister ended up in Wisconsin, his brother ended up in New York.
Yeah.
And there was one brother who stayed, obviously my direct line, he stayed in County Clare. But, we don't, for me, having done their stories, they would have spoken Irish at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Ireland.
Yeah.
They were illiterate, most
Yeah.
likely. So they would have arrived in this land where they're speaking both French and English in many, so they have all of this happening. The weather, and that's why Ontario was so popular, because the climate was pretty good for Irish.
Yeah.
They felt at least there was a certain, they could adapt to the climate. So, how much they had to adapt, how much they had to integrate and be part of, how much they were judged, because certain categories of Irish who came over were judged as being, they're illiterate, they don't know how, the Governor General at one time said, let them work on the roads first and then we'll see how they get on. So they were there. But actually, they did a lot of the building of the infrastructure that Canada now has. Like if we see the new canal, if we see all the pieces, actually the Irish played such a huge role in that story, but we don't always bring it to the fore. And I've no doubt that my ancestor, he was a labourer when he died. So I'm sure he did. He did some bricks somewhere and made part of it.
I mean, when you put it in those terms, it really is quite stark that the Irish immigrant, certainly the Catholic Irish immigrant experience, is very tough. They're not going, they know they can't go back. There's nothing to go back to, even if they could get a ship and afford it. As you say, they don't speak the language. Their only skills are essentially manual labor. And as you say, they build the Rideau Canal, the Welland Canal, they get involved in the infrastructure. Here in the Ottawa Valley, they muscle their way into the lumber industry, for example. And then John Egan, that I mentioned, he would sell the cleared land at half price if you were Irish. So he was instrumental in getting so many Irish settling in the Ottawa Valley and Pontiac and places like that. It was an incredibly tough experience for them, and yet they made it. Of course, those years were nothing compared to 1847, when panic really hits Ireland during the famine, and we have 100,000 come to Canada. You've done a bit of work on that too.
Yeah, it's the famine. Obviously in our own history, we'll talk about it, but we know that those who came to Canada, they came in significant numbers. We know that, I think, was it over 1 million died and over 1 million emigrated. But of those who came to Ireland, They started off their life on Gross Eel, which I know you have visited, like myself, and it's very eerie, and you can feel those lives there. You can absolutely. So Gross Eel was set up in actually 1932 because cholera, our first pandemic. We now understand about global pandemics much more, but Gross Eel was set up as a quarantine station, and so many Irish went through Gross Eel.
Was that was 1832?
1832, Gross Eel was established because of the cholera, which did get to Canada. They'd hoped that by doing this quarantine stations, they could stop it, but unfortunately, it didn't stop it coming to Canada. And they set it up there, but I think over 5,000 died there, and
that's right. Yeah,
the crosses that are there in the grounds, the names that are etched.
And it's very evocative. I mean, when we did the commemoration in July, we had people literally in tears. And then, of course, there's Irish common graves all along the St. Lawrence, and including here, thanks to a local historian, Michael McBain, we discovered that in fact there's a mass grave of about probably 300 Irish family immigrants here in Ottawa, which has been forgotten about. So, but on the other hand, of the 100,000, a fifth died, but 4/5 made it, and went on to make. Well, many of them, of course, went to the United States, but those who were here integrated and made a great contribution to Canada as well. Now, if you're in Canada with Irish ancestry and you're interested in finding as a genealogist, what's the top piece of advice you give people, and where do you start?
Well, where you start is with what you know and what you absolutely know. So you know who you are, you know who your parents are, hopefully. So you start gathering all the information that you know, or the oldest person that you know. Talk wide, to your family, to your extended relatives. Like me, find a relative you never knew existed. We think we know everything. We don't know everything. And be like a detective with any documents you have. So try and understand. But also look to history. What was happening at the time? So why would somebody have done that? Don't get caught up with the spelling of your surname, because this is where sometimes people say, no, but it's absolutely spelt that way. Many were illiterate, so they were going by the sound of it. So sometimes we have to say out loud the name.
Oh, interesting.
To understand what was the name, and the age. Ages vary greatly, and not just for women being vain. Birthdays weren't so significant, so we see in Ireland in our census records we only have two sets of census records that have survived, but between 1901 and 1911 there's a great jump in ages. We brought in the Pensions Act, so just what was happening at the time.
Yes, yeah.
All of a sudden
incentive.
They were happy to be older. What I have found is, though, Irish people are phenomenal of knowing where they came from. So I've rarely found a mistake about the county you came from.
That's interesting.
Affinity. So that is, I'm yet to find a real mistake. Sometimes they're by a neighbouring county, but when you look at where they came from, it's on the border. So you can actually see maybe the border was slightly different. So they know where they came from. And townlands, I think this is something that is very Irish. We have 60,000 townlands on the island of Ireland.
Yeah.
So if you can get where somebody's townland is, it's usually about half a mile, a mile. So it's not a big area.
Yeah.
So you can, and I've, with clients stood in the middle of a field in Ireland, and they can just feel their ancestor, and it is, kind of scary. Like you feel this feeling, but I felt it myself and I understand it. I don't think it's so. Try if there's any sound of a townland or a county, hold on to that information.
Right, because that's very specific. Then if you can get hit the townland, it's a time. I mean, it's really precision targeting. Yeah, and now if you're if you know the townland, what kind of records can you access?
So the first thing I'd say, there's lots of free records first. The Irish government have been really good about trying to make as many free records available as possible. Unfortunately, they're on lots of different websites, and I will post up after this maybe some of the top free websites so that people could know it. But from our national archives, you can get our census records, you can get land records from the 1820s. So you've those. IrishGenealogy.ie, not to be mixed up with my own genealogy.ie, but IrishGenealogy.ie has birth, marriage, and death certs from 1864 onwards.
Yeah.
And they're free. So within, obviously within certain periods. The National Library of Ireland I'd look at. We've the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland. Then land records. If you know your town land, in 1850s there was the Griffiths valuation was done.
Yeah.
And that's great because that lists who was there on a townland in those 1850s period. And often you'll see is maybe your ancestor came to Canada, but a sibling will still be at that townland, hopefully, or nearby.
Yeah,
so the likelihood is somebody will be there. And that's where understanding their place names and understanding who they are. And the most recent one that has come online is called the Virtual Treasury. And it was a project called Beyond 1922. And it's what they did was in 1922 in Ireland, our records office got burnt at the opening of our Civil War. Unfortunately, the records office burnt down, and you should go and see it. It's an amazing story. But this project, Trinity College took the lead, but the Government of Ireland gave funding towards it. And what they have done is they've tried to recreate that public records office, and they're beginning to bring back more and more records. And you can go in there now, and all of those are free.
So these are the duplicates that were sent to London, basically.
Duplicates sent to London, but they've gone to, and I know that they've gone to Canadian institutions.
All right.
Records. They've gone all around the world getting records.
Great.
And it's going to start really building up. So going onto that site, virtualtreasury.ie, it is just, and you could just, we all do this. I type in Hassett. That's
and see what happens.
That's my surname, and I see what happens, and I start seeing different Hassets around. So just go in and have a look. You never know what you might find about your name. And what I have found when you're doing your family history is people say, no, I don't know anything about that. And then I find a record or two, and they go, oh, I remember.
The light goes off in their head and they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
That makes sense. I've heard that before. That sounds actually, so go in and have a look. So I would advise people, there's lots of subscription sites and you can go on.
So just on that, are subscription sites worth it?
They're worth it if you know what you already want to do, but don't. Okay. I suppose my fear of people going onto subscription sites, and there's some brilliant sites and they have fabulous records and I use them all the time, is that they give you lots of hints. And so people start attaching information to their family that's not belonging to that person.
Oh, okay.
So you think, oh, well, it's Michael Hassett. It has to be my ancestor.
Right.
I traced several Michael Hassets in Australia, and I then was able to work through going, that's not my Michael. It's not.
So you really have to be in control of your own research. It's not a shortcut. No, they're not going to do it for you. You have to be in control. And that's why you always start with what you know and build backwards each step and just triangulate and try and understand, well, if they were there, I've seen people that have on subscription sites, they have family trees where the person got married 3 times in 3 different countries, and have had children in each country. And you're going, look, just physically couldn't have happened. Yeah.
Even with airplanes, which they wouldn't have had at the time, this person couldn't have flown to all these countries. So
it's also the other thing that struck me when I saw my great grandfather fill out the form for the census, and he scratched out something and said scholar for my grandfather. He's a scholar. This was a great thing. So there's a real thrill in seeing the handwriting. And seeing the names all and some and even in the official documents, this beautiful handwriting, and then you have X, and then you have a woman and spinster or whatever written beside, and and in the census as well, because he was from Mount Pleasant in Dublin. There's a record of the animals that were kept. This is in the middle of Dublin, and they all have chickens and sheep and pigs in the background, and there's obviously horses and dogs. I say, what? It must have been a cacophony in the middle of Dublin, because they're all And the other thing that struck me was so many of them are packed into these tiny houses. Yeah. And they're renting a room out to somebody, and there's the widow there with her 19-year-old son, and she's living in one bedroom. And it's a whole portrait of a completely different way of life, you know?
And that's the way to look at these records is like, you have the 1901 and 1911 census online. The 1911 is in the person's own handwriting.
Yeah.
But there's also forms behind it that you see how many rooms did they have in the house.
In the house, exactly. Yeah. That's what I was looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so start and that building up that picture and trying to understand their life. Go onto a map, or Ordnance Survey has old maps online, so you can actually go on and look where were they at that time.
Yeah.
If you're looking at birth, marriage, and death certificates, they would have had to sign them, and when they signed, the informant signed them. If they put an X, you can see that they didn't write. So then you know that any records you're looking at, they gave the information to somebody.
Yeah.
So that person could have transcribed it wrong. That person could have got the spelling wrong. So just understand that not everything is as it seems. I think sometimes people say, but the certificate says this.
Yeah, and you've said.
We all make
the other thing I noticed was the transition in language skills. That 1901 you can have, they both speak Irish and English, and by 1911 suddenly the kids are only speaking English.
Yes, it's quite remarkable to see. And with census, we also know people sometimes want to put down what they think is the right answer.
Yeah.
So 1901, they were giving the information to a person who was enumerating on their behalf. 1911, they wrote it themselves.
Yeah.
So maybe that could have, and each family can be different, but I'd be quite inquisitive when I'm looking at records.
Yeah, that's a good piece of advice. Just because it's written down, don't assume. There are all kinds of reasons why people write things down.
There are all kinds of reasons. And sometimes people, I had one great aunt, and her name was Lily, as far as everybody was concerned. She was never Lily on any official document. I've now categorically removed it. So she and I'm trying to remember what her name was, because she was known as Lily, but on her official document she had another name. And when I got the debt notice in the newspaper and was able to attach it to her debt record, I was going, this woman just did not like the name she was given.
Never went with the name. There's another thing which, and you could tell how accurate this is, that very often the eldest born son was called after the mother's father, and the eldest born, the firstborn daughter, was called after the father's mother. Is that a reliable pattern?
It's not reliable, but it's certainly very useful. So I would always be looking to see. So there is a naming pattern that the Irish traditionally would have had. Some people followed it, some people didn't follow it. But I would look at that. I would look at, there's church records are now online. The National Library put on church records. And if you look at who are the witnesses, so because they might be uncles and aunts. Just trying to, who was the witnesses when your ancestor got married?
Yeah.
Why would they have been witnessed? One recent one I was doing is, I was saying, why did they get married in Dublin? Like, because they're from Kerry. And then I looked at the priest. The priest was the brother. So they wanted the brother to marry them.
Yeah.
So, just always be that inquisitive and understand. And on my subscription sites, I would also say, look out for offers around St. Patrick's weekend. They often give free access to those sites. So
watch out for, don't get tempted. Look before you leap.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously technology has revolutionized this. What about the technology of DNA?
DNA, I've done my own DNA, and it is very interesting. I think DNA, there's still a long journey to go with us understanding. But it is really helpful to us understand those migratory patterns. So if you come from Ireland, there has been a huge amount done on DNA. And North America, all of North America, huge. But if your ancestors are Asian or African, I wouldn't be looking to DNA, because they haven't done enough sampling size to understand it. So this is where you just, again, be a little bit skeptical and understand where. But DNA has uncovered a lot of information for people, and maybe stories that we need to talk about. And we need to just name them as history. And I think this is our overall approach to history for me, is that we've tended to hide certain things and add stigma to it, or add layers and suppress it, rather than just speak the truth. And that's the truth. But understand, I didn't live at that time, so I don't know what choice I would have made. So to understand, so with DNA for a client, we've discovered, who their, parent is, and who and I'm very strong you have an absolute right to your identity. You have a right
Yeah.
to know who you are. You don't have a right to a relationship. That's something that's an additional piece, but you do have a right to know who you are. And I do think we have further to go to ensure that everybody gets that right. And
Yeah.
DNA helps us with that, for
Yeah.
people to understand, was my parent Irish?
Yeah.
Is that where they came from?
Because I'm glad you mentioned that, because there is a darker side to all of this, which we haven't mentioned, and I think deserves to be mentioned, which is that in the very censorious ultramontane Catholic Ireland that emerges after the famine. I mean, the church becomes hugely powerful after the famine and into, well into the first 100 years of independence. There is that dark side of, unwanted births and children and illegitimacy and a huge degree of social shame. And then, of course, the church and the religious institutions are in a way kind of tidying that away. And we know that very often the circumstances of those children were brutal, even to the point of death in some instances. And I think that's the point you're making, is that if you're descended from somebody or you're one of them, you are entitled to know who you are, but not necessarily relationship. But there is that dark side to our own history, which is interesting because, we have this issue in Canada, obviously, of the Indian residential schools. But in a way, we did that to ourselves back in Ireland with, the mother and babies homes, the Magdalen laundries, the industrial schools, and so on. And because of, as you say, people are living in a society in which there's these hugely powerful forces of shame that influence their decisions, including presumably decisions to emigrate.
Yeah, without doubt. And I think we're only beginning to see a light into that part of our history. I think we feel that we understand it, but we don't fully understand it. But
Yeah.
absolutely, the church played a role, the state played a role, and that's part of me wonders why we continue to nearly keep that cover on it, that we're nearly afraid of what we're going to see. But we do see the echoes. I've many good colleagues in Canada, and I see the echoes with Canada. Obviously, they're very different stories, but it is this story about the authority knowing best.
Yeah.
And the authority saying, this is what is best for children. This is what is best for the mothers. We're going to do this. We'll take your baby away off you. It's a burden for you. My own mother would say that when her father died, she was one of 5 children at that time, and her mother was pregnant with the 6th. And they were living in poverty. In fact, my mother grew up thinking she had relatives in Canada, but in fact, it was St. Vincent de Paul were giving them food parcels. But the mother would say, you're
that's the story being told is, we're getting up from family. Yeah.
Well, one aunt, this famous Aunt Lily, actually suggested to my grandmother, why don't you put your children in an institution, keep the baby, and put the children in an institution. And, this would have been 1940s Ireland. And my mum said her mother must have known, because she never heard her mother swear until that day. And she kicked Lily out of the house for even suggesting that the children go in to an institution. And then equally on my father's side, his parents died when he was young. And he says an aunt, actually, a great aunt, she took over looking after the children phenomenally. She took a demotion in the civil servants to go and move back to Cork and look after these children, 6 children also in their family. But my uncle, my dad's younger brother, says that when she was with the 6 children, she was stigmatized because she was treated as a lone woman with 6 children, even though she was an aunt.
Yeah.
Given up, a career to go and look after. So they're people who are in society, and equally I've met those who, were in mother and baby homes. One story that will stay with me, Eamon, is one woman. She was 10 years married. She'd had a few children with her husband, and she decided, now is the time to tell my husband I was in one of these homes.
Right.
And he left her. He left.
Oh, no.
He could not handle the stigma. And 10 years married, and 10, so.
Yeah.
I don't realize the impact, and so that's where we feel very privileged, and that's why I feel I have a role to play in helping them uncover those stories and understanding who they are. And it's not our right to add to that stigma and shame that they're carrying. We do shame really well.
No, we do, and it's a hugely powerful force, which is actually quite deep in our history. I mean, the whole Brehon laws, which dominated Gaelic Irish society, were all tort laws, but they were enforced through basically social shame because we didn't have a centralized criminal system. So it actually is quite deep in our DNA. It's not just about our cultural DNA. It's not just about the Catholic Church. No. But I mean, we all have the stories. I mean, one of my aunt, this is late 1950s, comes from a middle class family. She gets pregnant, snuck off to Spain to give birth to the child and give the child away immediately. I have a first cousin floating around the world somewhere. I don't know who he is, where he's gone. Unfortunately, she then contracted TB and died in Spain. But again, never really talked about. You know, we only learned about him 6-7 years ago that this story was there. You know, and there was always this mystery as to why she had gone to Spain. And of course, it was staring us in the face. You know, but you're right. But I mean, I think it is that you and I have been privileged to live in a period of change in Ireland that has been absolutely dramatic. I mean, the society I was born in 1960, so the society I grew up in is gone.
Yeah.
And I have to say, thanks to people like you, because what you did for corporal punishment is very illustrative of change in Ireland. It takes heroes, very often women, who force the issue of, you know, contraception, divorce, abortion and freedom to choose. It's very brave women that stood forward and said, no, we're not putting up with this oppression and this. But it also explains presumably the broader pattern we see of so many women are emigrating throughout the centuries. They're going in vast numbers. I mean, more than half in many cases, because they don't have opportunities and they're living in these very repressive places, you know?
Yeah, and I suppose they're looking to be free and to be who they are.
Yeah.
And, you know, that journey that Ireland has done in the last 20 years, as we uncovered our shameful past, you know, and then, you know, being appointed for me in 2011, part of that was that we were going to have a referendum on children's rights, which we did, and we successfully put children's rights into the Irish Constitution. We then saw, you know, our referendum, you know, we've had marriage equality, the women's health, our abortion. So if you had said to me 20 years ago that Ireland would be able to deal with these issues, even for my own, I would have wondered, no, that's not the Ireland I know.
Yeah.
You know, that's not what I know. And yet, you know, it's been such a positive change, but it's brought people with us. So it's not a change that it's been oppositional piece, and that's where I think is really fascinating, is as we've learned more of our history, and I do think the commemorations and what we've done has helped us in understanding our sense and who we are, and understanding that life is complicated and our history is even more complicated, has helped us realize that I can vote for something. It doesn't mean I have to fully support it or I have to do it myself.
But society is going to be better if we live like that.
And if we're more tolerant and we allow people to be who they are, and that actually living in an Ireland where everybody is different, but because we're so different, and, you know, I see the way we're in the majority embracing new people coming into Ireland.
Absolutely.
It's vibrancy that we don't have the singular interpretation of what being Irish is, other than that sense of inclusion, that sense of diversity,
shared culture.
It's just such a brilliant
creativity.
Yeah. And I'm really proud to be Irish. And when I see what Ireland does around the world, you know, I see the role that we've played on the Security Council. I see the role, you know, that our voices.
Peacekeeping and Irish aid.
You know, we're a small country. You know, like all other countries have had a complicated history. We've had parts that we've talked about that, we hang our heads. But instead of just hanging our heads, we're doing something now about it. We're actually saying any action we take from here forward, judge us on what we're doing, judge us on how we're doing it. And I think that's part of our own reconciliation with who we are, is to take those steps forward. And that's why those referendums that we had have been so hugely powerful. And so, you know, I don't think I'll ever have a memory like the night of the marriage equality referendum, being on the street of Dublin. and the just joyousness.
Joy.
It's like we were all in this lovely drunken haze now.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I don't think I'd had a drink at that stage, but it was this
But it
sort
felt
of
like that.
was this, like, I nearly felt like what you were told about the 60s, all this, everybody going up and hugging one another, and just
so it was a moment, because as you say, that's the point. Everybody kind of agreed on it, you know. But just tacking back to the immigrant thing as well, that sense of community, I think, and I'd like to give you know, as an ambassador, it's always a point of pride to see the degree to which Irish communities bind together to help each other. So, you know, well, like ICANN in Toronto and Vancouver, the GAA have been absolutely critical wherever immigrants have gone, you know, and I came across them in Korea as well as here. And of course, when I was in Washington and New York, you know, the sense of community. And very often when they create the GAA clubs or they do the immigrant welfare, we're not exclusive. You know, we'll embrace other people coming along, you know, and that's very much a part of it. I'd just like to end, Jillian, on a question, which I think is a difficult one in one way, but do you see a difference in the way Irish immigrant communities have evolved between, for example, England, Australia, Canada? We've touched on the differences between the United States and Canada a bit, but how would you kind of look at that, at those patterns?
Yeah, there definitely, it is very different how the communities are, and I do absolutely agree with your shout out to the GAA, because it's given people a focal point, and it gives people a point of connection. And you know, when I worked in Brussels, you know, I didn't play GAA, but it was a point where you could go and meet everybody, and that was absolutely super about it. If we look around the world, it is very different. Like we see in the UK, so many, you know, during the famine and before, went to Liverpool, Manchester, those type of areas. And they lived in their communities, and they had their Irish communities there. But it was a very tough life they had. And many of them would have wanted to go to America or to Canada, but didn't have the funds. So they were really struggling there. We see Australia has that. It also has a very complicated history, because we had the convicts going, and we had children. You know, orphaned children were for that better life that they were going to have, but often were put into hardship and had really tough lives. So you'd very tough start to life. So if you survived in Australia, you know,
you were doing well.
You were doing phenomenally well. And then we have those, and I do find it fascinating how in America you had, in the USA, you had that, you know, playing up of being Irish and embracing being Irish. And then here in Canada, it was the assimilation. How do I survive? How do I adapt to this? And so nearly it was like, I'm an undercover Irish for many. And because there was different definitions, you know, we see people will say, I come to Canada and I saw my first Orange Order parade. You know, I've lived in Ireland all my life, never saw one until I come to Canada. Equally, then on Patrick's Day, you have the other side. So it is interesting to see how different communities adapted and how people came into those. And it is different with every country. And that's why understanding the history of the country, understanding where they landed, why they landed there. You know, my own ancestor who landed in Wisconsin, you know, who I said wouldn't have spoken English. Half that county that she lived in spoke German within 5 years of her being there. So it's also understanding what other influences were coming in, where were migratory patterns and coming in, and having those different lives. But I'm hoping with initiatives like what you're doing with the 50 Irish Lives, that people start saying and understanding that being Irish means many different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But hopefully it makes you feel included in who we are, and that you feel one of us, as well as being one of whoever you are. And that's maybe an ending is that Irish citizenship ceremony. I think everybody should have to go to one, because they make that great speech about you can still shout for your home team and shout for Ireland. They're not mutually contradictory. And you don't have to choose a side when you're Irish, because being Irish will always be part of who you are, but you can work and be part of the country of where you live, where you belong as well, and they don't contradict.
Absolutely. Jillian, it's been a real pleasure. I learned an awful lot, and thanks so much for all your advice and guidance. We will post up some of those links that you mentioned, and we'll be welcoming you to